Local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Frank Tomaino's our guest. Frank's the guy we go to when we want to talk local history, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Frank, of course, is a longtime columnist for the Observer-Dispatch, and notice, Frank, that I said long-time columnist for the
Very long.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking today about some of the people getting inducted into the Hall of Fame at the Oneida County History Center and being designated as living legends. But we're not going to dwell so much on them. Rebecca McLean was in here a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the new ones. But we'll talk about some of the old ones. We'll talk about how it got all started. And the Historic Hall of Fame goes back to
1946.
And who was the first ones, Frank?
Well, really, the first five, I've got them written down here. I know Grover Cleveland.
What's his connection to?
Well, Grover Cleveland was the 22nd president of the United States and the 24th. And not a native of this area, but his father eventually was head of the Presbyterian Church in Holland Patton. President Cleveland's mother, fathers, brothers and sisters all lived in Holland Patton. For a while, Grover Cleveland lived in Clinton and attended school in Clinton, not for long, but he did. So you got the Clinton, New York, and the Holland Patton really connection. And when he was governor of New York and then later president, he would visit Holland Patton. And I believe his brother was pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Foresport. So there's a lot of connection with the Cleveland family.
He had a sister that distinguished herself.
Rose, his sister Rose. When Cleveland was elected president in 1885, he was a bachelor and he needed a first lady. And he asked his sister, who was living in Holland Patton, very well educated, a writer, a well-known author, to serve as first lady. She agreed. So for the first 2 years of his presidency, Rose Cleveland was our first, the official hostess. Cleveland got married while he was president, and married Frances Folsom, and of course she became first lady. So Rose returned to Holland Patton.
Didn't she distinguish herself with the Red Cross?
Well, with the Red Cross during World War I, she was in her 70s, and the Red Cross, and there was a need. She wasn't a nurse, but there was a need for volunteers in Europe, and she went to Italy and helped work with some of the refugees there. And while she was there, I believe in 1917, during World War I, she contracted the flu, and she died in Italy, and she's buried there. It was curious, when I began my column 100 years ago, I heard about, I knew very little about Grover Cleveland, and I did not know about his connection in Clinton and in Holland Patton. So before I was going to write the first column, I got in my car one beautiful day and I drove to Holland Patton, and I went to the cemetery there where Cleveland's mother and father were buried. And there was a guy mowing the lawn there, and I said, where are the grave sites? And back at the cemetery, I saw the grave site of Grover Cleveland's mother and father. And in the big monument there, it did mention Rose and some of his other brothers. Grover Cleveland's not buried there.
Where is he buried, do you know?
I believe in New Jersey, somewhere in New Jersey. He was born in New Jersey. But anyway, so I decided to write a column. One of my first columns, this was 1962 or 63, was about Grover Cleveland. I can't believe the reaction I got.
Really?
I mean, a lot of people didn't know it. I didn't know his connection. So he was one of the first in 1946 that the Historical Hall of Fame inducted into the Hall
Who
of
were
Fame.
there was what, 3 of them? or
Well,
4
I've
of them?
got the list there. Grover Cleveland, Horatio Seymour, of course. We all know about Horatio Seymour.
And he was the, speaking of the United County History Center, back when it was the United County Historical Society, he was the first president of it,
He
wasn't
was
he?
in 1876. The Historical Society of the Oneida County. One of the reasons it was the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And many counties had historical societies, but Oneida County did not. And some of the Horatio Seymours of the world around here discovered that we were losing a lot of artifacts. People were throwing away Civil War uniforms. This was, 11 years after the Civil War ended. They were throwing away letters, medals. So a bunch got together. The mayor was Charles Hutchison in the mayor's office. There was Horatio Seymour, Roscoe Conkling, Helen Munson Williams. We ought to start a historical society. So in December 1876, it was incorporated. So I think Ulysses S. Grant was president, and the Oneida County Historical Society was formed. They did not have a building or anything. At that time, the Utica Public Library was on Elizabeth Street, as you know, the old school administration building later. And the library gave them a couple of rooms just to store stuff. Then in the 1890s, Helen Munson Williams, I always say the same thing, if anyone deserves a statue in Utica, New York, it's Helen Munson Williams. She decided to build a building for the Historical Society. It was in honor of her brother and her father. It was the Munson Williams Memorial on John, Elizabeth, and Park Avenue, that triangle there. She died before it was completed, but her daughters, Mariah Proctor and Rachel Proctor, completed it. And that became the first home of the Oneida County Historical
You
Society.
remember that building, I remember that building. That was a beautiful building, Frank.
Oh, when I was a kid, I spent more
Yeah.
time in there.
Yeah.
It was yellow brick, had a red tile roof, very unique building. One thing about Helen Munson Williams and the Proctors, they always went top shelf. They always got the best. And she hired architect Richard Hunt from New York City, very famous architect, to design the building. And she said, I want it to look different. And boy, he come up with a beauty.
The only thing that building didn't have was parking.
That was one of the problems. The Oneida County Historical Society, would have their meetings there, would have programs there, but they never had parking.
Yeah. I think there's a noodle shop or something on that site today.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
When we come back, let's talk some more about that first class of inductees
Yeah, okay, sure.
for the Oneida County History Center. Frank Tomaino is our guest. Short break, right back. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. We're talking about local history on October 26th, Wednesday at Valentino's in Washington Mills. The Oneida County History Center is going to have their annual dinner where they induct living legends and recognize people who are going into the History Hall of Fame. And that's what we're talking about today, is the History Hall of Fame and the first inductees back in 1946. You mentioned Grover Cleveland.
Horatio Seymour,
Horatio
of course,
Seymour,
who
the
ran-
first president. Who
ran
else?
for president of the United States.
Almost won?
Almost beat. This is 1868. He ran. He was a Democrat, former governor of New York during the Civil War, well known throughout the country, and lived on Whitesboro Street and had a country home in Deerfield, where SUNY is now, SUNY Poly. But in 1868, Ulysses, the Republicans picked Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant to run for president. It's similar to 1952, when the Democrats picked Adlai Stevenson the Democrat to run for president, and the Republicans picked Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yeah.
It's tough to beat a war hero. But they picked Seymour, and the early polls, Grant was way ahead. But Seymour began to catch up. At that time, there was no campaigning. He sat on his back porch, as did Grant. But then Seymour decided to campaign, and he started to go up in the polls. And when the election, the electoral vote was way in favor of Grant, but the popular vote was very close. I believe with millions of votes, it was only 300,000 difference. So it was a close election with the popular vote. But Horatio Seymour was just well known. And in 1876, when the Oneida County Historical Society was formed, he became our first president. In fact, if you go to the History Center today, in the main gallery, in the back, there's a huge portrait of Horatio Seymour, our first president.
Yeah, as long as we're talking about the early beginnings of the History Center, their first project was quite a monumental one, Frank.
Yeah, at that time, the site of the Oriskany, the Battle of Oriskany, was farmland. Farmers would be planting their crops, and all of a sudden they'd dig up a skeleton or something in the those who were killed during the Battle of Oriskany. And the first project, the Historical Society decided we got to do something to preserve that history. So they bought, I forgot how many acres of the site of the Battle of Oriskany, and began a fundraising campaign to build a monument there. And they were successful. The monument there today at the site of the Battle of Oriskany, and the site itself was due to the Oriskany, to the Oneida County Historical Society, a first project that was very successful.
Yeah, that monument's in pretty good shape after all those years, huh?
Yeah, I guess the state maintains it. I was always hoping that I'm forgetting the National Park Service, that runs Fort Stanwix. Now I know they do a lot of work at the Oriskany battle site.
And there's there's that natural connection between the Battle of Oriskany and Fort Stanwix.
Of course, yeah. And Herkimer, General Herkimer, was on his way to raise the siege of Fort Stanwix when Herkimer and his troops were ambushed at Oriskany, which was the Battle of Oriskany. Yeah. But
anybody else that
well, you got Elihu Root.
He was the first
Clinton.
one. Yeah.
Oh, very, very famous. A native of Clinton, a graduate of Hamilton College, became Secretary of War during President McKinley's administration, and then Theodore Roosevelt named him Secretary of State, a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1912. Very distinguished statesman, corporate lawyer, and almost a president of the United States. Very few people. I remember I wrote a couple of columns about this. When William McKinley was first elected, he served 4 years. When he was going to run for re-election in 1900, his vice president, I'm forgetting the name now, had died. So he needed a vice president candidate to run for his re-election. He wanted Elihu Root, and he asked Elihu Root. Root refused. He just didn't want to be vice president. So instead, McKinley picked Theodore Roosevelt, he was sort of kind of wild, you know, and a lot of the Republicans wanted Root. Anyway, McKinley, the election, he won re-election. Theodore Roosevelt became vice president instead of Elihu Root. 1901, McKinley's assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And one of the top Republicans at the time at McKinley's funeral told some other top Republicans, now we have that damn cowboy in the White House.
Yeah.
So Elihu Root, if he had accepted, he would have been our 26th president of the United States.
Yeah.
To me, that's what makes local history so interesting.
Yeah. Elihu Root, the Army Reserve Center up on Burstone Road, named in his honor.
Yeah, one of the reasons for that, when he was Secretary of War, when McKinley asked him to be Secretary of War, Root told him, I don't know anything about war. But Root was just a brilliant man. And one of the first things he did when he became Secretary of War, he started the War College, which still exists, which trains colonels and lieutenant colonels to be generals.
Mm-hmm.
And which is one of the reasons the Reserve Center is named after him. You know.
We'll talk some more about all this. Frank Tomaino is our guest. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. Frank, longtime Observer Dispatch columnist, writing about history all these years, and author of History Just for the Fun of It, a great book. And we're talking about this year's October 26th, Wednesday, starting at 5 o'clock up at Valentino's. It's the annual Hall of Fame dinner. You can get tickets by calling the Oneida County History Center. We're talking about the first class of History Hall of Famers. Who's going in this year, Frank? Just run down the names.
Well, I've got in the Living Legends, Robbie Dancy, Sister Maureen Den,
Yeah.
Joe Fricola,
Yeah.
who was very active. I know when he was instrumental in getting the Purple Heart Park on Erie and Court, and I remember he asked me to write a letter to supporting it, which I supported. He does a great job for veterans. And Jim Moran, the voice of Vernon Downs.
Yeah.
I never met him personally, but I talked to him on the phone.
Oh, he's a great guy, and he does basketball up at Hamilton College.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah,
he's got a great announcer's voice.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And who's going in for the Living
Hall of Fame,
Legends?
Dr. David Brown, who was the first African-American dentist. I remember years ago, I interviewed him. I believe his office was on Court Street, later on Genesee, but very active in community events, civil rights. He was a member of course, the NAACP, but the Frontiersmen, a group of African-American business people. Charles Cleveland, when you had Brad Valeri on not too long ago, he was a Civil War veteran who earned the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War. B. DeSantis, I knew B. DeSantis, very active in Democratic politics and working at City Hall. I remember because I lived on Mary near Cassuth, not too far from B. lived on Bleecker near Cassuth. Very active. Peter Gainsworth, who was commander of Fort Schuyler at the time during the Battle of Oriskany, and Bonnie Woods, which I didn't know, but very active in the Mother Mary Ann West Side kitchen at St. Joseph St. Patrick's Church. So it's 9 people, quite a class. And I'm looking forward to attending that.
And you mentioned Mother Mary Ann's West Side Kitchen. Mother Mary Ann is a member of the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, she was. I have a list here. The first year was 1946. The Reverend Samuel Kirkland and Asa Gray, great botanist, born in Sequoia, later became very active at Harvard University and well-known botanist. But the second year was Stephen Babcock from Bridgewater. Had a lot to do with the butterfat in milk. He come up with it. But he was instrumental in the discovery of vitamins, I found out. So he's a very active guy. Rose Cleveland, who we talked about. George Eastman from Waterville, founder of Kodak. When he come out with a little camera, you push the button, we do the rest.
Yeah.
That was a great
I
slogan.
remember that, yeah.
Yeah. Thomas R. Proctor and Baron von Steuben. But the third year, 1948, Mother Mary Ann Cope, now Saint Mary Ann Cope, which to me is remarkable. Here it is, 1948, so many years ago. She wasn't really in the news at that time. Then later, when some of the people at St. Joseph's Church, they began to drive to have her named a saint. But in 1948, yet the Historical Society recognized her as an important person.
Yeah, Mother Mary Ann, of course, distinguished herself on the island of Molokai.
Molokai, working with the lepers at that time.
Yeah.
Well-deserved a saint. I mean, and it's fascinating. All the sisters who follow her there, she made a promise. To me, this is a miracle.
Yeah.
She made a promise that they would never catch leprosy, and they never did.
Yeah.
I mean, at a time when, if you work with lepers, usually you got leprosy yourself.
Yeah.
Fascinating. William Floyd, the signer, one of the 4 New Yorkers who signed the Declaration of Independence, buried in Westernville, lived in the latter part of his life in Oneida County. Henry Inman, a portrait painter from, grew up in Yorkville. James Schoolcraft Sherman, Vice President of the United States. Garrett Smith, the great anti-slavery and the abolitionist. The fourth year, Dan Butterfield, who we talked about a lot, composer, co-composer of the Bugle Call Taps. Theodore Faxton, great man, founder of Faxton Hospital, of course. Samuel F.B. Morse, who's been the inventor of the telegraph, a portrait painter, well known in Utica. In fact, his second wife was a woman from Utica. Spent a lot of time at number 3 Rucker Park. Anyway, Mariah Proctor, Thomas R. Proctor's wife, who, one of the ones who worked behind the scenes, just a great woman. William White, you don't hear about William White, but he was, I believe, president of Utica Drop Forge. But when automobiles first come out in the early 20s, became popular, you know, we forget most of the roads were not paved. And he worked statewide to get roads paved. William White. Got something stuck in my throat. Huh? And the last year, 1950, was E. Prentice Bailey, longtime editor of the Utica Observer, really nationally known as an editor. John Butterfield, Dan Butterfield's father, really the country's Mr. Transportation. We've talked about him. Francis Kernan, great Democrat, U.S. Senator, a U.S. Senator from Utica at the same time Roscoe Conkling was a U.S. Senator.
Good people.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got to cover all those. October 26th, Wednesday, Valentino's, if you want to go to this year's dinner, and give a call to the History Center. Frank, always good to have you.
Yep, great to be here. Yep.
Thank you. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget CNYhomepage.com. Lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.